Okay, let's get started. It's after 5, and you know what's after this? It's break time and dinner. So we're nearly done, right? So we've done the panels. We have had a great conference so far, and now we're going to conclude this part of the conference with a commentary by. I like to think, how about this for a phrase? Discussant at large. Yeah.
Very large nowadays.
And our discussant at large, our commentator, needs no introduction.
Okay.
But I will give him one nonetheless, since he sent me one upon my request. So, Ronald Grigor Suny is the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History and Political Science at the University of Michigan. And he's Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago. He was the first holder of the Alex Manoogian Chair in Modern Armenian History at the University of Michigan, where he founded and directed the Armenian Studies program. And he's the author of such books as The Baku Commune, The Making of the Georgian Nation, Looking Toward Ararat, Armenia in Modern History, The Revenge of the Past, Nationalism, Revolution, and the Collapse of the Soviet Union, The Soviet Experiment, Russia, the Soviet Union, the Successor States. They can live nowhere else. They can live in the desert, but nowhere else. A History of the Armenian Genocide, Red Flag Wounded, and Stalin, Passage to Revolution. And he's also been the co-author with Valery Kivelson of Russia's Empires. And he's currently working on a book on the history of the nation form and the recent upsurge in exclusivist nationalisms and authoritarian populisms, entitled Forging the Nation, the Making and Faking of Nationalisms. Go ahead, Ron.
So I'd like to start with what is for me a kind of nostalgic Soviet style ritual. I'd like to thank Mike. Because it's not just that he organized this conference and that he took Jeremy's advice to invite me here. Not only did he do everything that we've seen and appreciated, but he's done it with such grace and such generosity and always care about whether we're happy, whether we're satisfied. And he's kept this thing going with 21 different papers, so which is quite extraordinary. So, Mike, I'd like you to come to Michigan and organize a conference for me next year. Okay.
It's my new gig.
Yes. And then I want to thank all of you guys who are in this field. And I wanted to say you should all appreciate that you have actually formed a community of scholars, which is quite unique. And the sharing and the understanding and all of those things that you've got is an incredible strength. In other words, we live, you know, on a bourgeois capitalist society, so most of us, all of us, and there are no alternatives anymore. And we're all individualists and we do our own thing and all this stuff. But you've created some kind of collectivity, which is really extraordinary. And that's actually, it's a critical mass that makes learning go forward. And so I think you're doing something extraordinary. And I have learned so much in these days, and I will need to digest that over the next period of time. I can say that after listening to all these papers, I am more confused than I was yesterday morning. But I am now confused at a higher level. I want to mention that there were revelations for me. And one is that political history is alive and well. I remember when my colleague at Chicago, Sheila Fitzpatrick, said, let's do social history with the politics left out. Well, it turns out she changed her mind later and wrote a very important article about bringing political history back in, though it had never gone anywhere. And we all are basically convinced that there is no social history without political history. And Moshe Levine was my mentor in some ways, who always made this idea. And I guess I would underline that there can't be any political history either, I'll say this a little bit later, without social history, cultural history, and a lot of other things. But you're well on the way to making this a really important field of study in our larger field. So I want to start with what I tell my students. I say to students that there are 5 cons of history, and we historians pay attention to it, and often people in other social science disciplines forget to include them all. And the first one, of course, is context, right? That there is really a time and place, that things are specific in some ways, and that we need to pay attention to time and space. And then secondly, the con of conjuncture, the way great forces come together at particular moments. The storming of the Bastille, February days of 1917, when, remember this, first women went out onto the street, and then workers and soldiers and so on. Besides context and conjuncture, there's contingency. We're not so clear about determining laws that cross transhistorically, but events, the death of Lenin in 1924, and other things are extraordinarily important. And then as a Marxist, I would emphasize contradiction. Things don't fit together. That is, things go in opposite directions at once. And finally, in all humility, and I think historians do this well, not all, not those who have stopped learning, I won't mention any names, but all the good ones. I'm almost going to mention, no, I'm not going to mention. But the fifth one is confusion, that we're not sure, you know, that thing. And how many times people said, well, I don't have the evidence for that. I can't go. And that kind of humility, it seems to me, is what generates continued learning. And I think that was displayed over and over again. So the first thing I want to say is something very congenial to me, and it may be personal, and I want to see how you're going to take this. But this new historiography is what I would call real history. It's critical history. And it's far different from what we experienced 60 years ago when I was a graduate student. I'm older than you think. Those were the years of the Cold War, when history was highly ideologized. And you had to maneuver your way through that. You in this community have really formed something quite different. It's not that you have to love Russia. It's hard to love Russia right now, right? We know we're all going to have to deal with this, and I will maybe speak to that a little bit later. That is, everything has changed, as I mentioned the other day. This is as big a change as the end of the Soviet Union, the war in Ukraine, and the way the world will reagirovat, how it will react and respond to the Russia that's being created. You don't have to be love Russia. You don't have to be uncritical of the USSR. But what was striking in the papers, I'd love to know what you think of this, was I heard no strident anti-communism. Anti-communism was absent. I'm an anti-communist. And by that, I mean, I don't want to do history that is deliberately an indictment of the Soviet Union or of Russia, but rather that looks at history in its complexities and seeks some kinds of explanation. Now, it's not, as we learned from the paper today, that Suslov was some kind of pussycat in Lithuania at the end of the war. I remember a colleague at Chicago, no matter what paper was being given in our workshop, it's not Sheila, by the way, but no matter what paper was given in the workshop, it could be on medicine, it could be on food supply, he would say, where's the gulag? In other words, you had to have the gulag because it was central to the way we understand the Soviet Union. So, and the other thing about the historiography through much of the Cold War was that it was deductive rather than inductive. It was top down. It often started with Marxism or some dogmatic representation of Marxism or Lenin's personality or something like that. And then what happened was either inevitable or foreordained or whatever. So that I didn't see at all here. The history here was inductive. It started with evidence. It mentioned when there wasn't enough evidence. And I think this is what I would call deeply textured history. It's honest, it's critical. I mean, Igor, for example, did not tiptoe around the difficult question of genocide. He read documents, and despite the politics of Moldova at the present, he saw no evidence of intention of ethnic elimination in whole or in part. So no genocide. And that takes courage. And this is, of course, what we all should be doing. And it's going to become more difficult. It's going to become more difficult. Now, I have 5 areas that I want to go through quickly where I think I've been learning from you guys. And I think these are all very critical in terms of moving this discussion forward. A lot of the paper, and beginning with Diana's very first paper, was about how the Soviet system actually worked. And that was so revelatory, careful investigation of now available archives. The question of the center and the periphery, or why reform was so difficult, or even whether it was possible, and why repeatedly it seemed to fail. I learned in this session that in these papers that the Brezhnev period was not so boring. 17 years and teaching all the way through it, I thought, oh, do I have to get through this again? But it wasn't of stagnation, but lots and lots was going on beneath the visible surface that you are uncovering. And that is quite an extraordinary thing. Building a kind of understanding of the infrastructure of a Soviet cultural hegemony in different periods in Soviet history was shown to me had to be repeated again, not just in the Civil War and the 1920s, but in the post-war period. Because now you had these newly annexed areas like the Baltic region, like Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, parts of Moldova, and it had to be done again. And there were some really interesting insights into that, but it was much harder than it would have been in the 1920s and 1930s when you were dealing with a massive country, the remnants of the Russian Empire, which was 80% peasant. Now you had areas that had experienced different historical evolutions in the interwar period that had undergone further modernizations and, of course, nationalizations. And now, how are you going to teach Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Moldovans, Ukrainians, people who lived in Lviv and earlier in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and so forth in Poland to become real Soviets? So that seems to me is a really interesting way, maybe comparatively, to look at the earlier period and its social conditions, and then how much more difficult it was in the post-World War II period. I very much was intrigued by, who was it who said this? Something about the deep state, as I remember. You know, oh yeah. So what is the deep state? Now, I've been learning Turkish because my younger daughter married a Kurd, and we speak Turkish. And it is a term used in Turkey, derin devlet, deep state, but it usually talks about the most extreme right-wing nationalist forces, the police agents, and their connections with civil society, right-wing, gray wolf, mafia types, and how that works together. That's not what I think you were talking about at all. I think you were talking about something else. And in fact, I think what the deep state is the state. That actually is the deep state. That is, it's all those people who were there over time, right? Leaders may change, but there's a state. And something goes on through time that is different from the changes that might take place here or there, particularly at the top. I thought Mike's paper was courageous, bold, and just what a young scholar should be doing. But I did think it went a step too far. That is, I think, and I'd love to hear more on this from all of you and from Mike as well. There's clearly influence of the apparat, but I wondered about how much control or manipulation there was of the first secretary. In fact, I think there may be a need to do work on the nature of first secretaries and what kind of power and limits on powers they had. And some of that, of course, is very much in Yoram and Oleg's book and in some other works as well. But it seems to me we have this new literature on authoritarianism. They call it autocracy. I'm not sure that's the right term, but authoritarianism, dictatorship, something like that. Milan Svolik, by the way, was my student at Chicago and a TA and a good friend, and he was terrific. And, you know, every leader complains about his or her orders not being carried out by this puffy mass that goes on below. And then I wonder, you know, if there's this deep state or the state and leaders are trying to do things, are the interests of the leaders that difference in some fundamental way from that state? That is, what are states about? Aren't they about the conservation and preservation in some grand sense of a system of privilege, power, property, its distributions? And that is this state really different from what Khrushchev wanted, though he may thought, as Gorbachev obviously did, that we're in trouble, things aren't working out, we've got to reform. And is the deep state only simply a break on reform? Or and also, is the deep state united as much as it seemed to be in the presentation? Or are there serious divisions? Another thing I learned from the papers and the discussion was there seems to be almost a ubiquitous fear on the part of Moscow and of many others of non-Russian nationalism. There seems to have been a kind of continuous anxiety about the possible fall of the system and the possible disintegration of the Union, which obviously ultimately happened. And there were accusations that appointments were made on the principle of nationality rather than the principle of competence in politics, поделовым и политическим качеством, as one paper put it. And Russian comrades seemed often to be most critical of these non-Russian nationalisms, always maybe or more often looking toward the center. I found that very interesting. That again would encourage us to do more comparative work, right? To think about how different is Latvia from what's going on in Georgia or Uzbekistan or whatever. I wondered about the Yorchak syndrome. So there's a Yorchak syndrome. Yorchak's book is brilliant. I remember going sailing with him on San Francisco Bay and him being so sloshed that we had to carry him off the boat. So, but he's a great scholar, a great scholar. He's a great scholar and it's a great book. But this Yorchak syndrome has convinced lots of people that almost no one really believed in the system by the end. And I wonder about that. And my own experience was not that way. There is a kind of devolution of belief. So first time I went to the Soviet Union was probably before some of you were born, 1964. And you could see then 65, 66, when I was doing my research for the first book, in the 70s, in the 80s, how from the top down, as some have shown, there was this erosion of belief. But there was also an amazing sort of commitment and even belief among many people in what was going on, particularly outside of cities. So I wondered about that, and I wonder if that shouldn't be not taken for granted, but investigated more thoroughly. Real belief in the system, if you really took what they said seriously, would, it seems to me, create real dissent, because there is a disconnect of falseness between what was actually people's experience and that distance of that lived experience from the ideas that supposedly they were proposing. I've always been struck when you read Svodky and other documents, how much they're written in a discourse of socialism. It's that socialism isn't working. You said it's about this, but it ain't doing that. And there aren't so many claims about you should be doing it like so-and-so over there, but what about the way we conceive of this thing, and why aren't we in fact doing what we ought to be doing? The importance of letters, that was also extraordinarily important to me, it seems to me. And it led to something that Val Kivelson and I sort of tried to work out in our book, Russia's Empires. States do not exist, or for very long, by coercion alone. They need what we called reciprocity. You have to deliver something to people so that they don't go out into the streets and revolt. And even under Ivan Grozny or under Stalin, there was some degree of this reciprocity. So we might want to look at that. And the letters, it seems to me, and what was showing seems to me a great window into how that worked. They were very conscious of what's going on. They tried to deal with what's going on. They wanted to find out. It's not simply a matter of control, but it's also about if you've given up huge amounts of coercion, then a state has to deal with the population in a different way, through persuasion, and the most difficult thing, delivering the goods, right? They have to think this is worth staying with you guys. And when I was hearing that paper, I thought, boy, thank God that there was no social media during Soviet times. I mean, imagine Soviet Twitter. What would that have been like? A big question was raised, I think, by Piotr about empire colonization and decolonization. And that led me to think that, sometimes historians don't want to pin down what they're actually talking about. That is, they're a little bit wary of clear definitions. That is, historians, we like complexity, or even if this is a real verb or a real thing, complexifying, rather than what political scientists or sociologists might do, which is parsimony. That is, instead of simple, clear explanations, we might make things complex. And we retreat often by saying, oh, it's much more complicated than that. Babam. There is, oh, that's Turkish, sorry. There is nothing, no statement you can make that someone couldn't say to you, it's more complicated than that, because every statement is somehow a simplification. We don't want radical simplifications like nationalism, but still these things are important. So things are more complicated. That's good. That's what we historians, I think, contribute. But it might be useful to think as maybe just as heuristic devices to be clear about definitions. And what I convinced Val about this as well, we call ideal types, something in the Weberian model. So that if we're going to talk about empire, then have a fairly clear idea how you're going to use empire in this particular work. It's not that someone who's dealing with India in the 18th century or 19th century has to adopt, but that you're going to use empire in a certain way. Now, in our book, in Russia's Empires, we defined empire as a system, as a form of rulership in which there is institutionalized difference and hierarchy. So difference is important. That is, there's a group that is distinguished from the people being ruled. So there's superordination and subordination. And see, this is what happens when you use one of these things. And the superior have the right to rule precisely because they're different and superior. Now, if that's true, then they're going to try to maintain that distinction and maintain that superiority. And that regime, like the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire, and Soviet Union, I believe, was an empire, that regime is going to have a great difficulty turning into something like our ideal type of a nation, which is based more, if not always in actuality, on homogeneity and equality. Instead of subjects, we're citizens. And so those two ideal types helped us navigate through a millennium of Russian history, from the primeval ooze to Putin. But what do you find in reality? Just what historians find, that it's much more complicated than that. That in between, there are imperial nations, there are nations that act as empires, and there are all kinds of ways in which empires are nationalizing. Nations were made within the Russian Empire, and certainly, I spent a career doing this, made within the Soviet Union. So whether by deliberate design or accident, nevertheless, that was important. So I say, yes, keep complexity, but also think about being clear about what terms you're using. It didn't come up much, but the question that always intrigues me and many in the public and among scholars is, why did the Soviet Union collapse? What is it about the system? Was it doomed? Was it обречена from the beginning, or is something else going on? I think it's very important, and good scholars have done this, to distinguish the end of the regime, that is the end of the Soviet system, which Gorbachev had already done largely, before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So he had gotten rid of monopoly of the Communist Party rule. They were on their way to move away from a command economy. The country itself was moving from empire to something more like a multinational state. All these things were happening. And then connected to that, of course, was the disintegration of the Soviet Union, which 76 something plus percent of the Soviet people had voted against in March of 1991. And then a few months later, after the coup, overwhelmingly accepted. So it seems to me that question is one that's still up for grabs. And it'd be interesting to know how what you guys have been doing with political history would illuminate that question. My own view is that the Soviet Union was not obviously the victim of some kind of revolt from below. That there was much yet to work with, but Gorbachev refused to do what states had to do, use the power that he had, and ultimately it was the Soviet Union that committed suicide. The center disintegrated and everyone fled as fast as they could. There's the big question then of ethnic conflict as well. And I think that was raised in the discussion that ethnic conflict is never purely about culture or language. It's also connected in complex ways to the material questions, to elements of social position, to class, as was shown in that very interesting paper by Ricardo of what happened to Armenians in Central Asia. The Soviets always had a problem distinguishing between nationalism and patriotism, which is what is the border from the beginning right to the end of what was permissible and what was going to be contained or punished. And the problem with that question was nationalism as a term was always available to be used coercively. So it was never purely analytical. And there's a lot of work by people in this group, by Mike, by William and others on national communism, which was testing precisely that border of how far you might be able to go. And they found out quickly where that border was. I remember in 1966, working on my first book in Armenia, in the Institute of Marxism-Leninism. They let me in there, and I was reading all this stuff, and they were going to have a party meeting to discuss Azga Serutun and Haydena Serutun. That is their own terms for nationalism and patriotism. And what I observed and heard was total confusion. They couldn't agree on anything. And that seemed to be precisely what the regime wanted in some ways, that it could use these terms very, very flexibly in order to punish whenever it was necessary. And it was a very handy tool to keep people in line. So that seems to be something that we could also look at. I was taken by the discussion of Mikoyan's speech of 1954. I, as an Armenian, always think Armenians are unique, and we did everything first. We invented the first shoe. They only found one shoe. Later, I think it was Georgians or someone who invented the other shoe. But there was the first leather shoe was found in Armenia. We are the first Christian nation. We were Christians before Christ. These things are matters of national pride to us. But the murder of Charens was a terrible thing. Charens was not anti-Soviet particularly. He was the Armenian Mayakovsky with all the complexities that would indicate. But Rafi and Patkanyan are a different story. They are 19th century nationalists. And if you read their poems or their novels, a lot of it is about killing Turks, right? So this would be this is really a move in another direction, and I would make that distinction very clearly. One question I'd love to ask you all, because you're now really a community, is, okay, maybe Armenians weren't unique, or maybe they were first, or maybe they weren't first. But what about the uneven appearance of new trends in different regions and republics? Did one place that saw what someone else was doing, maybe those Latvians that you're writing about, say, I wonder if we could do that, and then find out it's not quite going to work that way, right? So it seems to me that we're dealing with people who are waiting to see what's possible and may imitate other areas if it's possible. So we've come to the point then where political history is really in a new moment of flourishing, together with social history and all of the other wonderful fashions which are now developing: the cultural turn, the gender studies, the study of language and discourses, comparative histories. You know, why was there basically no real ethnic violence, though there was ethnic difference and conflict in the Baltics or Ukraine, but real violence in Central Asia? You know, some tens of thousands of people are killed in Karabakh, in the Caucasus, in the riots in Central Asia and so forth. And I think there was a real call, and Yoram showed this really beautifully in his paper. There's a real call to integrate all of the things that you're discovering into this burgeoning literature on authoritarianism, dictatorship, and what unfortunately people are calling autocracy. In other words, what I think you're doing is modernizing political history, and that's really important, and making it respectable in a way that it was rejected roughly in the 1970s and 1980s. And finally, I would say this: we have to respect what we do. And what we do, this careful, critical, empirically based, but theoretically informed scholarship, is more important now than I think it's ever been, because we're living in an age of disinformation, in nationalisms, and in which nationalisms are demanding certain kinds of history, in false facts. And Salvas mentioned the distinction in passing between what we do, and which will always be under attack, that is critical academic scholarship, and other forms of history like popular history, which of course deals better than we do with things like the weather, furniture, shoes, appeals to the prejudice of the readers, because basically popular history is based on commerce, selling books, whereas ours needs a different kind of patron, like universities, and we may be losing that. So that seems to me we have to fight for, and we have to do it well so that they let us continue to do this in our little privileged sanctuaries of the universities. We also, of course, have to contain our emotions, even though we must be passionate about our subject and our region. And we must not, in this very difficult moment with the Ukrainian war, mistake the present for the future. Russia will go on, Ukraine will go on, and we've got to learn to deal with the new Ukraine and the new Russia that we're going to have. And we must remember that what we do and who we are the source as a human science of the only real database we have to understand not only the past, but how we got where we are and what possible paths forward there might be. Thank you.
Thank you.
I earned dinner, right? I earned my dinner.
You
Yeah,
definitely
okay.
earned your dinner, as did everyone actually. So, but we did build in a very small slice, a ludicrously small slice of time for one or two questions, or perhaps, you know, just for the discussion.
Or comments, you know,
Or
I'd
comments,
love to hear
exactly,
what,
yeah.
because, yeah, this is not my area, but
But we are going to wrap it up though to give us a little bit of a break before dinner. So 10 minutes. Anyone? Yeah. Okay, Alex, go on.
Oh, you don't want to.
Sir?
You don't want to take a circle.
Why I haven't seen it.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I was expecting Forest, but yeah, maybe everyone's. It is 5:30. So yeah.
Yes. Well, one of the things we haven't talked about until now, although it's featured peripherally, and is a response to Professor Suny's remarks about the Russian fear of non-Russian nationalities. But we kind of dodged around the issue of Russian nationalism, which in a way is the biggest boogeyman of all the CTSU. And it's actually whether, I mean, I would posit that Russian nationalism is what destroys the Soviet Union. That's actually what tips it. Where you know, Yeltsin cuts off oil to Ukraine, where it becomes clear that the Russian National Party is on the march. This is, you know, that's the future. That is actually what shatters the whole complex of things. Others may disagree. I thought possibly to raise it because it hasn't featured a whole lot in the papers, but it's kind of there in the background of a lot of them. And obviously it's been touched upon by Sasha in relation to what is the same and what is different about the war that we're unfortunately, tragically witnessing this now. But maybe we should be talking more about Russian nationalism and trying to study Russian nationalism in the Soviet period as a phenomenon.
You also mentioned language, which I think was also avoided quite substantially. How we speak about various parts of empire, prejudices that come to the fore in our descriptions of our neighbors and others we live alongside, and how that can kind of endure not just in the period that we study, but carries into the present. I find that that for me is, you know, the hardest to process. It's hard to dissimulate when you're just reading like all of this really rough and aggressive language. So I think that, you know, you raise the issue of emotion, which I recognize is really important. But there's also scholarship on emotions, right? And how you process those things alongside this, you know, left brain, right brain triangle that we have to go because we're human beings too.
Go ahead.
I wanted to just say that it's interesting mentioned with Pietro in youth that how tendencies in different republics at different times. Because what Pietro was talking about protection of the rights of Armenians all over the Soviet Union, Ukrainians came to this idea in 91, 92, so it was quite some time. But that brought me to thinking about unless I'm mistaken, but I don't think there are any studies on inter-republican relationship between Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Georgia, or the relationship between Soviet Ukraine and the Baltic states. And yet when I came across in my research on Ukraine, during the Historica, there are former Ukrainian, former wood sands, there are people from Lithuania who study this or that. So inter-republic relationship, horizontal relationship with the Soviet Union. Is there any material even to work with? I mean, this is just absolutely an open.
It's a great field to investigate, it seems to me, because I remember all these books that existed in the 60s and 70s about культурные отношения между армянами и украинцами, and all of the exchanges of sending delegations to republics. I think there would be a lot of material. This would be a good dissertation topic for a really enterprising student. And I mean, it'd be good to know one or two of the non-Russian languages, but you could do it even from, because this was, I mean, Družba Narodov was a real thing. They were developing. This was something they were going to promote, and how it worked and didn't work. And there are some historians now working, a woman named Erin Hutchinson, who just got a job at the University of Colorado, in fact, worked on similar things like that. And how One Republic, a novelist in Armenia, was read elsewhere. And so there are things, there are ways to get that out there, yeah.
I actually agree. I'm going to say that, yeah, because it's not, although I think we often told it is like the spokes of a wheel that only must go through the center to communicate. And I want to say that you hinted at it before, Ron, that Azerbaijan definitely checked on what Latvia was doing in terms of national communism, and I know this because Krista Goff confirmed it to me that, and I've seen some documentary evidence as well that they were reading the Latvian newspapers and they were wanted to see how far are they going, so that we can do the same, but they are treading the path of, making sure that this invisible line that we like to talk about, have they tripped it? Yeah. So and that was with language, it was with the education reform. Yeah. So sorry.
Mike, you remember we had been a symposium in Uppsala for that topic, exactly, inter-republic relations.
Yeah, we did.
Interesting, great.
It was a great topic. Yeah. And Ricardo wants to, will hold at some point in time a conference on, beyond Moscow, about the, emphasizing the independent actions of republics, their own foreign policy, and their ability to exercise control beyond the Soviet Union, which is brand new. You can say something about it too.
Hopefully, I hope that this will be developed. I mean, we just launched a call for paper and we got some 70 replies. Very interesting. I mean, people working on the field and working about the regions and the international dimensions in regions, in economic cooperation, in politics, in intra-party relations. Unfortunately, what I was experiencing for this conference, which had half of the participants from Russia, so it's basically impossible, just the idea to hold at that time at this moment, is to some extent I'm scared that the kind of anti-communist bias that before was perceived in our field now will turn into an anti-Russian feeling, and so I'm not sure if this conference will take place as far as things are going in this way. And also, I would say I find a non-friendly environment even in Italy, because I speak about Italy, but I think that it's not that far from other realities in Europe. So. Yeah,
sorry, and we'll mention at the Vilnius Symposium yesterday, but we did indeed, yes, hold that specifically on Dushman Narodov. Sorry, Pietro.
I just wanted to say thank you, Ron, for those wonderful comments. Really, really great closing remarks. I really enjoyed them. I definitely agree with Natalia that there is room for kind of this, inter-Republican investigations. In fact, it also could be, a foundation for kind of scholarly collaboration. So let's say you might not know Armenian or Georgian, and the other scholar might not know Ukrainian, but you can work together and you can do something. I mean, even like you were alluding to this, Natalia, with this idea of Myasnikov, Myasnikan, that even you see there was an Armenian leader who was leading Belarus at one point. And even in the culture, Ron mentioned about novelists, but think about, Sergei Parizhanov. He was making films in Ukraine. So you have that, even though he was Armenian. So you have those kind of connections on the Russian nationalist bit. It's very important because Russian nationalism, as we saw with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, has explosive potential to destroy Russia. And it has even the potential to destroy the Russian Federation. So I think that definitely it merits more exploration and more kind of critical examination, because it's to be very disastrous.
This guy Myasnikov, right? So the name is Myasnik, right? It's a Russian word. And his name in Armenian, I don't know what it is. Misagorts, Misagortsan, which would be butcher. But they took that name, and then of course what the Armenians did was they Armenized it, put IAN on the end. But it's a Russian name.
Died very mysteriously in an airplane.
In an airplane crash. Anyone who died in the Soviet Union is always mysterious, right?
It is Alex, but I'm sure he won't mind yielding to you, and then it's him, and then we'll call it quits. So go ahead.
Just an end to the discussion of Republic. What I found also in my work is that the republics don't just look at the other republics and what's happening there, how far they can push based on what's happening in what. They also use what's happening in other republics as an argument with the center for more resources, a kind of a bargaining chip, saying, why does Armenia, that is much smaller than us, has 9 theaters, and we only have 6 small theaters? So there's all of that going on. It's a really interesting theme, I think, to start pulling with the internet.
So
Alex?
Sorry, just kind of just the last 2 points on Russian nationalism, and also I think this conference is this relation to the Russian Soviet Union. I think is another kind of topic which comes through because a lot of work been done. Petro in particular, shows that. Try to argue that there's a lot of the Soviet project which was not Russian. There was a lot of contribution, and so forth. But broadly speaking, there's a tend to be equation between Russia and Soviet Union. Certainly in my students, kind of like try to write Soviet and talk about Soviet Union and so forth. We always write Russian, right? So I'm just wondering if that moving away from Moscow-centric approach, you don't kind of overlook the issue of the of Russian nationalism and relations with the Soviet Union, and you can approach it in some different ways. But also, I'm wondering, how to think about Soviet Union, Soviet period, also within kind of broader framework of Russian history, whether it was really just the Russian Empire disguised in Marxist language, or whether most of it, how there was most of it talking about kind of trying to regress Soviet Union on a different basis, on kind of the Russian nationalist basis, is it really kind of viable and so forth. So I'm just thinking that's certainly an area of approach which is not to kind of completely leave aside, because that's what the paper remind me we did in
I'm about to say you did why what was the no Russian party in the RSFSR? I think it's interesting. I remember, yeah.
So I think there's kind of this debate we've had, and also I think there's a lot of kind of things with comparative approach, because I'm kind of thinking about Brexit and England's position within the UK, which also doesn't have a parliament. Its own parliament doesn't have its own prime minister, first minister, whatever. So, but dominates Spain is another example and so forth. So I think there is actually kind of broader ways of thinking about Russia, Soviet Union.
Yeah, I'm not one who thinks Russian nationalism was that important, in particular at the end of the Soviet Union. They didn't win many elections, but there was among cultural intelligentsia there was such a thing, and it had gone on through the Brezhnev period. But I think I always felt that it was more exaggerated than a reality. After the Soviet Union, and particularly under Putin, it's now become something that's much more powerful. The Soviet Union as an empire, of course, however you define empire, it seems to me is sui generis in certain ways. No, empires may have similarities, but they are very different in certain ways. The Soviet Union was this bizarre empire in which goods and services flowed out to the peripheries, except maybe to the Baltic countries, rather than the other way around. And there, the ideology, the idea that we're going to, eliminate the difference between country and city, that we're going to eliminate differences between these different republics, periphery and center, those played an important role and determined how they would allocate goods and services. So, you want to, yes, okay, it's an empire, but it's a very particular kind of empire. And it's so nice that we're here at the University of Glasgow, because a book that absolutely influenced me was this book by Alec Nove and a guy named Newth, N-E-W-T-H, on Soviet Central Asia. And it was like, during the Cold War, someone could write that Central Asia is being more effectively developed by a communist regime than what was going on in Afghanistan or Pakistan or whatever. And it was, but that kind of scholarship would work in this country and was very difficult to work in the United States.
I'm just going to wrap up with, were you saying something, Tim?
Just a brief point.
And then Tomasz, and then we got to call it quits. So
there actually was extraterritoriality in Ukrainizacja in the 1920s. So language rights for the Ukrainians, education rights for Ukrainians in the North provinces in the Far East. So there was a precedent for that.
Tomasz?
Thank you very much for the excellent summary. And my question goes, I'm stupid, openly. So explain to me what you mean with Soviet, anti-communist or communist, pro-communist Soviet research. Because once you mentioned, I think I get it right. Okay, I have done some work on those Eastern European Institute of National Memory, and so on. So I think I get it right, and I agree fully. Nevertheless, it's still puzzling me because anti-communism is everything in communist vocabulary. What is not pro-communism? So there is a black and white world, either communism or anti-communism. The same problem I have with this Russophobia, because you are either or, there is nothing in between. And that's why I simply reject the concept as such. But this is a very frequent question, and from my students as well. What do you mean with Soviet research not expressing, clear, open anti-communism as you?
Yeah, that's a good. That phrase, "I'm an anti-communist," was something that I was that Moshe Levine mentioned. So we talked about that, right? No, it's not that you're pro-communist or you're uncritical, but that you don't come to the subject with an agenda to indict. You come to it with an agenda to understand and to explain. And it's a very different thing. And maybe it was easier in Britain or in some other countries than it was in the United States. And I didn't hear any of that here. I mean, people saying that Suslov is, doing some, you didn't quite say that he's a nice guy fellow, not an angel, not a demon, but hey, it's not the Suslov I grew up with, or Latvian, starting with paper one, that trying to explain without indictment, without accusation. Go and look at some of the major figures in the United States: Richard Pipes, Martin Malliot, Steve Kotkin, Timothy Snyder. These are indictments. Anne Applebaum. These are the people that people read. And it's very different from what I heard the last 2 days.
Okay, so let me just say a few things, and we'll about functional things. So now we're going to finish. We're going to meet at 7 o'clock at Chaku's for this nice Indian Iranian dinner. I'll explain how that's going to work. Persian, sorry. As it was before 1932. And so I'll explain how it's going to work when we get there. Chaku's is, again, very close to the Bothy. It is down a lane. We just have to sort of keep going. That lane is opposite the Hillhead Metro, so you will be very easily able to see it. So on the other side of the street is that lane. Tomorrow we will meet again here for the last round, 9 o'clock sharp, because we've got lots to pack in and people have got to go. So some people, but so we want to get really stuck into the working breakfast. So don't really have breakfast in the hotel. Have it here. We're having a nice working layout table. So you're going to get the food. You're going to sit down. We're going to have a nice time. Yeah. Sorry. Is there going to be some haggis? Yeah, get that. Yeah. Grab that. Grab the tray. Bring it here. So last thing, yeah. So it's not easy. It's not easy to sum up. Like, it's not easy to be a discussant at large, and you're summing up this as we've only just finished. So thanks again, Ron. That was really great. Yeah.
Thank you.